recording it and posting it onto our YouTube channel, Minnesota Atheists. You can just search us on YouTube. Debbie Goddard, she's the Vice President of Programs at American Atheists. She has over 2 decades of experience as an organizer and activist. She became involved with the secular movement as a college student in 2000 and attended atheist, freethinker, humanist, and skeptic groups meetings in Philadelphia, New York City, New Jersey, and central Pennsylvania. Her involvement has increased over time. She's held several different positions. She's been with the Center for Inquiry office in Rockefeller Center. And in 2002, she was recognized as the BeliefNet Godless Who's Who list as the student activist and as an out non-believer. But yeah, since she's done so many things over the years. So she's worked for the Department of Campus and Community Programs, Center for Inquiry, Outreach Director for CFI, and directed the African Americans for Humanism. She led a notable billboard campaign featuring Black atheists, and just so many things over the years. She's also engaged in LGBTQ activism, civil rights work, and training new organizers in her community. She facilitates workshops and gives presentations on campaign building, evidence-based activism, diversity and outreach, group organizing, humanism and politics, and other topics for community groups, campus groups, and national conferences across America. So we are so grateful that Debbie has gave us some time today to join us and present to us. We are excited to hear from you. So I will transfer it over to you, Debbie.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. That was lovely. And thank you for inviting me. I have a couple of questions. First, when should I stop talking?
It is completely up to you. We've definitely had speakers that have gone just 15 minutes to an hour. Is a wide range, and we can have it be more of little speech and then question and answer. We really let it be up to the speaker to have a reign of things and speak on what you'd like and for how long you'd like.
I cut out about 3,000 words because I kept adding things in the last couple of weeks as I thought of them, and I was like, oh, that's another thing I should mention. Ooh, that's a good example story. That'll make the point. And then last night I did a run through and was like, oops. Oops. And I messaged Ben on Facebook real quick and was like, hey. So what I was interested in, if people like this, I assume the group would probably be about this number of people. Do people want some more discussion? There are a couple of points when I can pause for questions before moving on. There's kind of 3 big chunks of the presentation, and I'd really like to have a lot of discussion at the end. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
So I'll try to present fewer things with less detail and leave space for questions and fleshing things out and other input or criticisms of my perspective. If anyone disagrees, I welcome that, actually.
That sounds wonderful.
Great. So let's see how that works from what I hope. So I originally was thinking of a talk that I didn't want to be recorded, that I've given maybe twice before, based on a paper I wrote, but then ideas had been coming together for some time. I was asked to write a paper for a symposium, which is outside of my realm of expertise. In 2015, the symposium was on humanism and race, class, and gender at Rice University. And I was like, I am not an academic. I do not present at symposia. What do you want me to do and how many pages is this supposed to be? And they're like, oh, only 20 pages. Anyway, I wrote a paper, but it gave me a good opportunity to put together some ideas that had been in pieces of emails and parts of discussions I'd had with other people in this community in one place. And I've used the basic framework, at least of the beginning, of sort of gelling some concerns and issues that I think we experience in our secular community into 3 problem areas. I think when we understand that they are problems and how we have at the foundation of our community, then it makes other issues we have seem very predictable. So for this, I rejiggered things and rewrote things. I wanted to talk about those 3 problem areas that I think exist at the foundation of our humanist, atheist, secular community, why they're problems, some high-level thoughts about what we can do about it or how I'd like to see things change, and then get into some more nitty-gritty about how things are changing and how we can all contribute in the spaces we're in to more positive change. So the reason I was thinking of requesting that it not be recorded and that I didn't ask for it to, or that I'd asked in the past, the other 2 times I've given this to different versions of this with the 3 problem areas to not be recorded, is because there had been some criticisms of parts of our community, and in one case, specific individuals in our community, and I had no interest in inviting their hordes to come after me because I had criticisms of them that were publicly accessible online, particularly as a staff person who's employed by an atheist organization. I thought it might harm the organization, and it would certainly harm my own mental health. So I've taken those specifics out. Perhaps when we get to the end for the discussion part, maybe we can stop recording and have a more open and free-flowing discussion. And for those of you who might be watching this as a recording, too bad, you should have come. So that's what I'm imagining right now, to be able to speak more openly and freely about some internal, inward-facing things. I know you're all in tenterhooks now, like, okay, stop telling us that you're going to talk about things and just talk about things. So let's do that. I had just opened to reboot my computer. My notes. I'm going to start with a story. The name of this presentation is Atheism is People, Building a Stronger Community and Movement. And here's the story I'll start with. Back in 2011, so long ago, when I worked at the Center for Inquiry, I was sent to represent the Center for Inquiry at the World Humanist Congress. And that's hosted by the international, well, formerly known as the International Humanist and Ethical Union, now called Humanists International. And it was in Oslo, Norway, my first trip outside of North America. And one night, as often happens at these, organizers, most of us who are connected with the youth organization component, got together in a bar, slinging back drinks, and kind of ranting about some of the very difficult situations we faced as organizers in this community, and how some people are just so pig-headed and they won't do things differently, or they're harmful, or did you see this thing that this one person did, or this is happening in my country. And I gotta say, it was kind of nice. It's nice to be able to have access to those spaces, but it was particularly nice to know that we're not alone in thinking sometimes that this is difficult work that we do. And some of the difficulty is coming from within our own community. It's not just the people that we're fighting out there as part of a movement, but also the people that we need to work with in different ways. And that I'm hearing that from people in Norway and Ireland and Nigeria and Kenya and India, just having similar kinds of problems. And one person said, you know, I think as a humanist organization, as a humanist movement, we would not have some of these issues. And I said, referencing Soylent Green, that it's because humanism is people. It's people. And so the same thing that makes us get involved in this as organizers, as activists, as community members, as volunteers, is going to be the same source of headache and frustration for us. It's that we're people. Atheism is people. Humanism is people. And that's the foundation of the talk I'm going to give, the issues that I think we experience and some of the perspectives that we have. So structurally, I mentioned I'll go into 3 problem areas. I'll give a couple of examples to illustrate some of them, and then talk about changes that I'd like to see and some things that are going on out there before we get into discussion. But first, I was a philosophy student for too long to not want to start by defining my terms. I think because you're Minnesota atheists, there's a lot of overlap with the humanist community there, that some people are humanists, some people are atheists, some people are both. There are probably a few people who are like, no, I don't like that other term for these reasons, but there's a lot of overlap in our movement. If I say humanism and humanist, I'm probably focusing more on the facet of our community and movement that talks more about values that we bring, positive values. More often, I'll probably use the term secular and just mean the larger umbrella under which we fall. When I talk about community, I'm talking about the people who show up for things or participate in different ways in something that's related to atheist or humanist or free thought identity. So not just your uncle's an atheist but doesn't know anything about the community, but some part of active participation in some part that's organized or with content creator communities online, things like that. And when I use the word movement, I'll be focusing more on that aspect that has goals and is trying to accomplish things, not just showing up for community meetings or discussions, but also thinking about how we can take action for change. Of course, that's at different levels, national, local, individual, but all of that I'm wrapping up more in movement versus just the people who show up for things and participate and watch YouTube videos and comment. And when I talk about organizing, I guess I should say that too. At the core, I've considered myself primarily an organizer. Most of my jobs, most of the work I've had to do, and many of my volunteer positions have been in positions where I've tried to work to bring people together to take some action for change. And I've given the example before of, someone who organizes a picnic. You have some goal, you want to get some bunch of people together at some spot at some time to have a picnic together. Movement organizers, we try to get some people together, that those people give us power to take actions to make change. So organizing. So let's get into problems. This is exciting. Problem number 1. Part of how we see our community, the foundation of our community, the ideologies of our communities, the foundations of humanism and atheism, is based on a caricature of the Enlightenment. When I worked at the Center for Inquiry, when I started there, Paul Kurtz, the founder, would tell this story about how philosophy and science that we promoted were created by the Greeks. But then he'd say, oh, the Greeks and how wonderful Greece was. And then came the Dark Ages and Christianity covering up all of these brilliant ideas until the Renaissance. He would always say it like that. His wife was French and he always made it big. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment, once again embracing science and reason. And here we are at the Center for Inquiry, carrying forward that torch of the Enlightenment. And I think a lot of people, including a lot of our thought leaders within our community, would say, yes, that's what we're doing. But the commitment that we have is to a caricature of Enlightenment values. And the problem is that our thought leaders and our culture of our community think that this caricature set of values are unquestionably fundamental to our community. So the way that we talk about reason and rationality, the way we talk about science with a capital S, which is of course unbiased, like it exists outside of humans doing science. And the way we talk about liberty and individual freedom, which were big ideas during the Enlightenment, those were ideas from hundreds of years ago. That's fine. Intellectualism, very simple ideas of equality. But there have been further developments in intellectual fields after the Enlightenment and building on the Enlightenment. And that includes sociology and psychology and better understandings of history and even philosophy and other things. I almost don't want to say postmodernism and existentialism, but these things came post-Enlightenment, building on the ideas of the Enlightenment. We've had other kinds of thoughts since then, including criticisms of the Enlightenment. So that's one of the issues, is what about all the other things? Is sociology not important? Well, if you're starting from Enlightenment perspectives on philosophy and people, you miss a huge field of how we understand people. A second problem is that it is a caricature of the Enlightenment. There were Enlightenment thinkers who talked about the importance of emotion in reason. And I jotted down a quote here, actually a couple things. Rousseau, Hume, who both had theories developing reason and emotion as working together to motivate action. And Hume said, famously, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. No one would say that Hume was not part of the Enlightenment. Yet when we talk about the Enlightenment, we poo-poo and diminish thinking about how emotions are part of how we work, and we only focus on the reason parts. So those are issues with how we use this like stereotype view of the Enlightenment and think about that as foundational to our community and the values that we try to promote. But it's not accurate, it's not correct, and it results in further problems. I think in the American secular community, we also have the issue of our Americanness being tied up to certain kinds of Enlightenment values. And that includes individualism and freedom and free speech. And when people quote people on these things in our community and in America generally, they're often quoting people from the era of the Enlightenment, like nothing's changed in 300 years, 250 years. Which, and by the way, looks different than it does in other countries. So it's also tied up to our Americanness and our American identity. I'll go into more about why that's a problem because it overlaps with other problems that I'll bring up. But let's get to problem 2. And I looked, no one's in the chat. Let me drag the chat window over so I can see it better. In case you're like, you're wrong, or I disagree. Problem number 2. And this is more to do with humanism as a philosophy. Our humanist identity equals good without God. That's the loud and important part, is the without God part. Even if in the humanist community, we like to say that humanism is a positive philosophy, 90% of how we're organized and how we think of ourselves is based on the fact that we are not religious like the religious people around us. I actually wondered if this might be different in Minnesota because I know that you have a close relationship with Unitarians there, that there's not so hard a line between like religious and humanist. However, in most of the community across the country, and what I see even at national organizations, is that the main focus and the foundation of our community is we're not religion. We don't have God. We're good without God. There's less investment in and commitment to the positive things that we stand for and believe in outside of the fact that we don't have God. We could also discuss that further in atheism land, but since humanism says it has a positive philosophy, it's much, much, much easier. There's also a lot of commitments, of course, to science, reason, and critical thinking. That means that the issues that a movement chooses to take on, take positions on, take action on, lobby on, educate people about, are much easier when we can define them as in contrast to religion. So a school wants to put up "In God We Trust" mottos. Of course, that's bad. We're against it. People want to pray in public schools. They want to pray at football games. We're against it. That's religion. No, it's not inclusive. Creationism in science class. That's religion. There's a lot of things with education and religion that's easy. Abstinence only education. Well, that's religion telling people how they should get educated. No. Chaplains in the military. Well, it's religious privilege. So we're going to have a position on that and spend effort and time on that. There's also science and skepticism side stuff like vaccination education. Stem cell research is pretty big. There are issues that are more difficult for us to take on that still have to do with religion most of the time. I actually took out my notes about the one because I had a long quote, which was very illustrative, but I may paste it in the chat later regarding why our community has a position on abortion. If you're interested in that, let me know. I have it in a document on my other monitor, and I will happily paste that quote in the chat. So our positive life stance in the humanist community is almost entirely reactive and negative in the sense that we're against someone else's position. For same-sex marriage, we're not pro same-sex marriage. We have a position on it because we're anti same-sex marriage, because the anti same-sex marriage people are primarily motivated by religion. It means when an issue can't be framed this way, as in we're fighting religion, it's very complex and difficult for us to take a position on it. Some places where this has been obvious in our community includes on transgender students. When we're not promoting equality and we can't frame it as easily as fighting religion, we're a mess. We're a hot mess on that issue. Anything having to do with race, which some people say is fringe to our mission, because racism is not religion. It's also complicated by the fact that a lot of people of color in this country are more religious than white people. But while we can say we do something about it, it's seen as fringe to the primary things that we want to do in our movement and community. So we're always anti-religion in our work and thinking about how we define ourselves and what kind of work we do. That's problem 2, reactive, anti-religion, don't have positive positions, can't get involved in some issues unless we can define them as fighting religion. Problem number 3, which is related to the other 2 and overlaps, is that we are all individuals. What I mean by that is we have a strong commitment to individualism. It's embedded in how people have written about our philosophies, our commitments, our life stances. It's on American Humanist Association's websites. It's in a lot of things about atheism, that we're all individuals. What we usually mean by that is that we're free thinkers. We don't do things just because of tradition or authority. But what that also means for us is that we poo-poo the social sciences, and we have a really hard time with any kind of like sociological perspective that involves thinking about people as members of groups. That includes groups based on marginalized identities like race. That includes things like sexism and women. That includes other ways that things affect us in society. So we also see in our community, of course, that for a long time, most of the participants have been white and men. And in social science, those are called unmarked categories, which is they're considered the norm or the default. You know, there's sports and then there's women's sports, for example. Mitch McConnell said something last year about African Americans voting at the same rates as Americans. It happens all the time. There's parents who don't like CRT, but then parents of color who may have issues with the book banning. So people in unmarked categories are less used to thinking of themselves in these groups. One person in our community whose name I'll mention is Sam Harris, who seems to have a very hard time with the idea that people are making him be a white man instead of just normal. But people who are in marginalized communities are more used to thinking of themselves in a group with other people. That includes Black people, that includes women, that includes youth, that includes a lot of different groups, and that includes generally atheists who are part of this community. For some of those identities, we have no issue. When it comes to the ones where people are used to it being unmarked, cisgender, that's a biggie. People get very angry and they say, why can't we just treat everyone as individuals? Why are you being divisive? And this is often tied to our humanist values and philosophy. I could give a lot of examples on this, but one that I also have quotes of is when the American Humanist Association posted a Black Lives Matter meme on their Facebook page in 2014. The hundreds of responses that included things like all lives matter, or this is anti-human, or we're just human, or why are you making me race? When I put out a speaker proposal form for the American Atheist Convention, and someone puts, we ask people for race, gender, if they're a member of the LGBTQ community with an explanation for why. I know who it is that puts human. I look them up sometimes just to check. I'm like, so in our commitment to individual freedoms and individualism, we are also against the idea that it's rational and valuable to think about people in groups and to understand that these group categories that we're in can affect our experiences in the world. And that often people who are members of the same group have similar experiences, have shared experiences. If you're an ex-Mormon from Utah, you probably have some experiences that are similar to other ex-Mormons in Utah. But when we say, hey, Black people in the atheist community may have experienced these things, there's anger and resentment and denial that these groups that we're in can have some effect on our experiences. They think it's anti-equality to even entertain the notion, and that the best way for humanists to operate is to be race blind, gender blind. We also think, in connection to this, we are all individuals, that our atheism or humanism inoculates us from bad thinking. That if we're humanists, we can't be racists. That atheists are much less likely to be sexist because we're way more reasonable and way better at critical thinking than other people. We're not tribal like those other people. After all, we are all Africans. And race is a social construct, people say, without understanding what a social construct is. And so these fundamental ideas of why our community is the way it is, how it should work, and what people think our values are at this deep level are actually optional and harmful to our community in these different ways. Those are the three big problems, and I'll do a summary. First was, many atheists and humanists have a strong commitment to a caricature of Enlightenment values. The second is that our community is grounded in a certain kind of non-belief and in contrast to religion of our dominant culture around us, and has a hard time with any other sort of values framing or actions that we can take. And the third is our strong commitment to individualism, and therefore our discomfort with the idea that we and others are shaped by culture and social interactions. Now, before I go on from there, and I want to say, those aren't just our community problems, these are human problems and human tendencies. But they are things that we tend to reinforce and foster and support, that people see sometimes as fundamental values of our community. I see that people said they wanted to see a quote, but no other big things. It's itching for later in the discussion. No big, all right. I'll go on from there. With an uncontroversial example of many examples I could give of how this kind of thing plays out in some of the actions that end up happening. So when I worked at the Center for Inquiry, for part of the time I was on the management committee. we were talking a lot about childhood vaccination campaigns and the fact that so many people were choosing not to get their kids vaccinated, and things like measles were making a comeback. What could we do about it? And I was new to the management committee at the time, so I didn't really know the flow and the culture and things. But a lot of the discussion was we could put something in Skeptical Inquirer. We could, I don't think this is super, we've talked about this a lot. I don't think I'm revealing anything out of place for the recording. But there was discussion about a billboard campaign, a special issue of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, putting additional articles on the Skeptical Inquirer website, having more focus on it at the conference, maybe running ads or doing other things. And as the discussion went on to who they could bring in to give talks about or write articles for the magazine, I suggested we maybe consider the fact that the large majority of subscribers of Skeptical Inquirer magazine are men. The large majority of people who make decisions about vaccinating a child, a baby, are moms. I think at the time it was 78%. And because they're new parents, younger people too, which didn't align with the subscriber base of Skeptical Inquirer magazine. So we could shout what we want to shout all day, every day in Skeptical Inquirer, and we're not reaching the people who are actually making decisions. I guess we're hoping that, people's grandfathers can tell them, pass the information on to them. But really, like, we know it's not the people who read Skeptical Inquirer magazine who don't know that maybe, hey, this information you're seeing about vaccines is wrong. Like, what we need to be doing probably is thinking about, like, how do these moms get this misinformation? Not just moms, young parents in general, parents of young children. Mommy groups, parenting magazines, brochures for doctors' offices, a different website portal that doesn't look like Skeptical Inquirer with like space in the background, like, who do we need to be able to reach with this information to actually have an impact on this? And later, months later, as there were concerns about things like the Women in Secularism conference and the accusation that perhaps I was a postmodernist Marxist. I was a philosophy student. I was like, that doesn't even make sense. Because I wanted our mission to be different, because I kept taking groups into account. I gave this example. It's like, I'm not saying we're sexist by saying that if we put things in Skeptical Inquirer magazine, we don't reach the people who need this information. It's organizer thinking to think that people's positions have an effect on them. It's good marketing to think about like what different messages and where appeal to which people. You don't market for Mountain Dew, the same way you do for, I don't know, herbal tea, right? Like, yeah, anyone could buy that, but the marketing is telling you, hey, this is, 20-year-olds on snowboards shooting down a slope. Like, there's a certain demographic they're going for. They think about who they want to communicate to and how they want to do that effectively. They run ads at certain times of day. We just need to think about that when we're doing our own educational campaigns, right? But there was that implication that, like, 6 men and me in a room, like something was wrong with them and not taking this into account. And I was like, yeah, we don't have young parents. We're not in mommy groups and stuff. And there are ways that we can understand this and try to do a better job of incorporating perspectives of people who we know aren't in the room and voices that we know are underrepresented, so we can be better at what we do. So that's one example, I think, that's uncontroversial of how these kinds of things affect some of the ways that we spend money and time and how we miss out on thinking effectively about things. I can give other examples in our discussion if you like, at different levels. But the fact is, like, people's age, gender, race, position, life experiences affected their ideas in contributing to space and would have affected how we put resources out to do our mission to try to educate people about vaccines as a public health benefit. So some summary points there. movement organizing is hard. Some issues are always considered fringe because they affect fewer people. There's always going to be discussion of and thoughts about whether something is mission drift. But there are certain people who have power who get a seat at the table often to make the decisions about whether something is within or outside of our circle. And there are life experiences that shape all of us greatly. People have different needs. If we're interested in growing and succeeding as a movement and community, we need to understand and accept that, ex-Mormon atheists may have different needs than like atheists in New York City, most of them, or ex-Muslim atheists, or Black atheists, or, LGBTQ immigrant atheists. There's like lots of different experiences that people have of non-belief and non-religion. And if we want to continue to grow and stay relevant and succeed at our goals, we need to take this into account. It's also the case that when people have multiple salient identities, like if they're Black, queer, and atheist, they don't need to be in the atheist community to find community. They have other options. So if we say, well, anything having to do with race is outside of what we do, you lose some people. If you say anything having to do with women's issues, well, that's fringe. It doesn't affect us all. All lives matter. Anything like that. When it doesn't take into account what's relevant to some groups, we lose people who have other communities that they can happily join to do work that they want to do around people that they like hanging out with. And we're left behind with what we've generally looked like for most of our experience and history in our community. It is uphill and we do have limited resources and time, but I think we can add this into thinking about what kinds of goals we want to accomplish and therefore how we prioritize things. Second, if America continues becoming more secular and we see more and more nuns, particularly younger adults, what appeal does a secular group have if everyone is secular around you? Like what do you do? Talk more about anti-religion when no one cares? So yeah, engaging in other kinds of relevant things where you are in the situations you're in, bringing that to people and saying, hey, this affects you this kind of way because of this is important. And third, on the humanist side, it's sort of shocking to me that humanists and skeptics and all of us, like, we are really concerned about educating ourselves about a lot of different things. We have lectures on space and philosophy and religion and history and other religions, but we tend to, not all groups, but we tend to have a pretty poor understanding of race, class, and gender within our community spaces. We don't tend to have the book club meetings on those kinds of things, for example. We don't tend to have good deep dive speakers at our conferences because often we're framing things as like we're fighting against them, the bad people, the religious people, the Republicans or whoever it might be. So our ignorance of these issues not only drives people away, but also just harms us in trying to be effective as a movement and community. Shouldn't we, as humanists who are concerned about education and making a better world, also be interested in improving our understanding of the world? Not just reading about evolution or science, but also how people work in society, how culture works, how discrimination works, and how we might work better. I could go on. So what do we do about this and what's the future look like? I'm going to name a few different things and then open it up for discussion. I just moved my chat window. Yeah. All right, great. A few things. One, I have a lot of lists here because that's how my brain works. We should value the social sciences much more than we do. And probably philosophy too. I was a philosophy student. I was kind of surprised in this community to hear people like Lawrence Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Richard Dawkins even like trash talk philosophy. And I was like, you're doing philosophy. What do you think is wrong with philosophy? And they're like, philosophy is useless. Science is philosophy, sorry. And you're not as good at science if you have no understanding of the philosophy of science. I think that's one of the problems. It's like, how doctors aren't scientists, they're doctors. Science should be something else. Well, scientists should understand, like even saying what is good science, that's a philosophy question. That's not a science question. More than that, we don't tend to have social science people. We don't have sociologists, and we don't have social psychologists who are sociologists on stages at our conferences, feature events, like reading the books. We sort of tune in when people do like demographics of non-belief. And we're like, oh, this researcher showed us that now 30% of Americans are non-religious. But what do they tell us about what non-religious people are like, what their needs are, what they do? Why are there more non-religious people? You know, what are some of the differences here and there? Why are people leaving religion so much? And how do we make effective community groups? How do we work better for social change? How do we build an effective movement? You know, what are some strategies that other movements have used in the past? I really like sociology right now. I say, as a former philosophy major, I was kind of amazed as an organizer, and I worked at the Center for Inquiry for maybe 3 or 4 years as with the title field organizer, before I knew that you could get books and go through trainings and learn more about organizing just as a body of work. I think because it's not, you know, a college degree program generally, it was not in my mind. And so not only do I think that we should do a better job of appreciating and valuing social sciences and social science approaches, I also think that we need to value organizers more. There are notable exceptions to this underappreciation for organizers. Secular Women is a good one. And groups like the Secular Student Alliance have really valued people who are able to put things together on the ground and make them work or pull together campaigns. But it would help us as a movement, as a community, understand better culture, race, gender, history, power, privilege, class, CRT, religion, gender, all of these things. In the appreciation for organizing, that should also include an appreciation for strategy and goals. Not all facets of our secular community are movement building, right? Some of it's support, some of it's just providing space for people who happen to be non-religious for different reasons. But there are facets that are movement, and there are people who think, including people who are engaged in this work, that the movement, the change that we're trying to make, is to make more atheists. I work at American Atheists. It's something that we've discussed. August on this call? August? I'm like, board member August, former board member August Berkshire, who was a board member for a long time. There are discussions at all different levels about how much of the goals of our movement or community are to make more atheists. How much of our education work is and should be promoting criticisms of the Bible, of Christianity, of Christian leaders, of, you know, the Quran, so that we can make more atheists. And I thought it was an older attitude, but I spoke to a 28-year-old young woman who is active in atheist TikTok now. I had a phone conversation with her, and I asked her at some point about resources that American atheists might help develop to help these atheist TikTokers. And the suggestions she made were basically how to argue Christianity better online, which is something that we don't spend a lot of time putting resources together on among the staff at American Atheists. There could be some discussion about whether we should spend more time or whether our advocacy goals, for example, would be better served if also we were trying to argue about religion with people to make more atheists. But the fact that there are other parts of what we do as a movement and community, including political activism, were unknown to her. So not only appreciation for organizing, but appreciation for the multivariate kind of movement that we have and community we have. At American Atheists, we talk about the ACES program, which is activism or advocacy for A. C is community, E for education, and S for service. SSA had put out the same thing, Secular Student Alliance, as the case for secular students, and it's a general organizing thing. When you are community building, there are 4 major kinds of things a community group can do, so it's not news. However, training groups to do better at this, to think about different kinds of tasks or different kinds of activities and actions that attract different kinds of people to get different kinds of things done to serve the community well, is something, it's part of what we're trying to do a better job of, pulling together our training resources and having more formal training for local group leaders. So more appreciation for organizing strategy, and wondering how much of our goals make more atheists. We have an opportunity now talking about what the future looks like, and I'm almost done. That particularly under Trump, Christian nationalism became a common term in the media. Even when I started American Atheist 3 years ago, there weren't a lot of articles or things coming out about that. And I sort of made a joke when I started there of American Atheist emails and communications being like, knock, knock, who's there? Christian nationalism. It was just a constant, like, the bad guys we're fighting is Christian nationalism. And Nick Fish, the president, said fairly, yeah, because, 10 years previous, they might have said religion or even the religious right. But now we have a bigger target, and we're not just fighting religion, we're fighting religion because it hurts people, and when it hurts people, and when it gets entangled in government and policy in ways that causes harm and is against equality. So targeting, Christian nationalism is who we're fighting, which understandable. Now everyone's using that term and have added white to it. So we're fighting white Christian nationalism. Under Trump and even before, this rise of white Christian nationalism as an organized and powerful force has driven a lot of liberal people and progressive people out of religion. That seems to actually be maybe the major driver of our increasing number of non-religious people out there. Not atheist YouTube, sorry. It's defining themselves against the work of these evangelical Christian nationalists and people who support inequality and bigotry in different ways. So that's an opportunity for us if we know how to be attractive to non-religious or less religious people who are most passionate about the progressive and liberal side of things and not so much the atheism part. Something to think about when we think about what our future could look like and how we build that. And last couple things is at the national and local levels, we have been evolving in ways to build more community partnerships and coalitions. At American Atheists, Allison Gill led the effort to create the Blitzwatch Coalition to fight against the Christian Nationalist Project Blitz efforts. And we've been pleased and amazed to see groups come on like the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. To join a coalition run by American Atheists, we have the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. The person who was attending the monthly phone calls was an African-American minister, woman, on our American Atheist run phone calls every month to talk about how to fight against Christian nationalist bills popping up in all these states. I don't think that would have happened 10 years ago or more, but it's how we think we need to be working right now. And we see that at the local level too, with a lot more state coalitions and different partnerships. And I think we need to continue doing that, and trying to do that well will shape and define some of our other movement strategy and tactics. Relatedly, one of the changes, if we want to be able to build coalitions and partnerships well, is that I think we're going to continue evolving to be less anti-religious. And this is not that like there's a philosophical underpinning that we shouldn't blaspheme religion because it's mean or dirty. We shouldn't be anti-religious when it harms our ability to accomplish our goals. And if our goals are like work with Planned Parenthood to fight for abortion rights in Ohio, then if the person who runs Planned Parenthood is religious, and we're also at the same time making fun of how stupid Christians are, we're going to harm our ability to accomplish our goals that will affect people's lives. So some of this again reflects back on strategy and the difficulty with our internet of separating like our in-group, in-community conversations and our out-group, more PR-friendly communications. What do our memes and tweets look like, for example? At the national organization level, I know we've been more cautious. Someone suggested a billboard a few years ago. It would have been really funny in Kentucky, of a Virgin Mary with a pregnant stomach and Joseph, and then saying something about like the importance of science-based sex education, since that was a big deal in Kentucky. And we all laughed, but we're also like, yes, but the groups that we work with in Kentucky, we don't want to be like, haha, virgin birth, God, you're dumb. That's not going to work for us. We really need to approach this a little differently. But too bad, we all had a good chuckle, and then we did not put up a billboard making fun of virgin birth ideas and science-based sex ed, because we think it's more important to try to get science-based sex education in Kentucky to happen. And in order to do that, we think we need to build coalitions and have good relationships with partner organizations in Kentucky. That, I think, is going to come out in lots of different ways, including when we think about just what non-religiousness looks like for young adults and even younger people. And the last I'll mention is, of course, something I'm very passionate about, is more investment in the grassroots. That's you. That's everyone. That's all of us. More training, more communication, more networking, more support by national organizations, more help. I don't think we have enough training. We used to do leadership conferences at the Center for Inquiry. A lot of people get into this because they're atheists or they move and they don't have a community. And some people end up in leadership positions and there's nowhere to turn to be like, how do I run a group well? There's a couple manuals out there. They're a good starting place, but it'd be really nice to have networks of leaders who can communicate with each other and really share things, or like, quarterly classes you can sign up for that say, should you have a 501c3? How do you deal with conflict in a group? Where's an example of a code of conduct for groups that have to deal with these kinds of issues? So if we're a good movement community, I think the relationship between the national orgs, the local groups, and the individuals, there needs to be more blending there. People at the local level feeling if they have ownership of their groups, they can volunteer for different things, help start new projects. Grassroots groups knowing that this movement includes them and having the ability to communicate up and down and across and share resources. There's a lot of flexibility too at the local group level to take on issues that national organizations might not have the resources or capacity to do, because there are things that they can do that local groups can't. So when it comes to dealing with, Black Lives Matter protests, that's something a local group can participate in and do. And a national organization might not have the resources or the mission line to take action when there are local protests all over the country. They can get the word out, but that's about it. So when it comes to setting the movement agenda, I think the grassroots groups need to be part of it in a more communicated and stronger way. That's a lot of where the movement is that we don't think about sometimes in different other spaces. In closing, atheism is people. And because it's people, our community must be informed by how people actually work, not just how we wish that they worked. If everyone was rational, like if everyone were a perfectly spherical cow and there was no friction, how nice that would be, but that's not how we are. We're messy people that work like people. So we need to understand what people need. We need to do a better job of understanding how people work, how we work, how groups work, and therefore then a better job of understanding and taking action to actually change lives for the better. That's my closing.